Hi everybody, and welcome to this tutorial on intonation. What we have prepared is videos that we will show you with the presentation, and at the end of each video we will have time to answer questions because all the videos are short relative to the time we have. There are 3 sessions of about 50 minutes each, including the presentation and the questions, so that we can have a break in between. So after this, I will share my screen and you can actually watch the presentations. Hi everyone, and welcome to the Intonation Transcription and Modeling in Research and Speech Technology Applications tutorial. Now, as our title indicates, the tutorial covers both theoretical and practical aspects of working with intonation. So we hope it will be of use both to those who are interested in doing research on intonation and those who are interested in speech technology applications. The tutorial is divided into 3 parts that deal with slightly different topics. In part 1, I will be talking about intonation theory, we'll presenting the major features of intonation and the fundamentals of the autosegmental-metrical theory of intonational phonology. In part 2, Kathleen Jepson will talk about annotation methods and tools that we can use to explore intonation data. And in part 3, Cong Zhang and Katherine Marcoux will talk about methods for modeling F0 and ways in which we can use these modeling techniques to interpret data in terms of intonation categories. What we will do is we will try to keep each part to about 50 minutes, including questions. So we will try to keep the presentations to about 40 minutes, leaving time for questions and for a little break after each part. Now, we start with 4 terms that have often been used interchangeably in research: F0, pitch, intonation, and prosody. The one thing to remember is that these terms do not mean the same thing, and therefore they should not be used as if they were synonyms. And what I will do in the rest of this presentation is try to explain what each term means in turn. So starting with F0. F0, or fundamental frequency, is an acoustic property of the speech signal. It is determined by the rate of vibration of the vocal folds, which in turn is determined by physiology, the speaker's gender, and related social norms. So, for example, women generally biologically have higher pitch than men because they have shorter and thinner vocal folds, but whether they use the upper part of their natural range or the lower part is culture specific. F0 is measured in hertz or cycles per second. Now, F0 gives rise to the percept of pitch, which is not the same as F0 because F0 is the acoustic property and pitch is how we perceive this acoustic property. There are 3 scales that we use to measure pitch: MEL, BARC, and ERB. Now, you may wonder why I have not put semitones there, and the reason is that semitones are not a psychophysical scale like MEL, BARC, and ERB. They're a scale that has been adopted from Western music, and therefore it doesn't really reflect how we perceive pitch. Another thing that we need to mention here is that when it comes to the frequencies that we are interested in intonation, which are between 50 and 700 hertz, the relationship between F0 and pitch is almost linear. Not quite so, but almost linear. So if you use pitch and F0 sometimes to mean the same thing, it is kind of okay. What is not okay is to do what is done by default in Pratt, which is to say that pitch is measured in hertz. That's simply an impossibility because hertz does not measure pitch. So please change that setting when you make figures. Now, the third term is intonation. And intonation is not the same as F0. We often see people use intonation as if to mean F0 and F0 to mean intonation. All languages use and modulate F0. However, not all of these uses are intonation. Okay, so not all F0 modulations are intonation, so try to keep the 2 distinct. Finally, intonation is a component of a language's prosody. And prosody includes also metrical structure, as we will see, the way in which we chunk words together to create phrases, the way in which we organize speech in terms of relative strength of constituents, and so on. So it is important not to use intonation to mean prosody, and in particular not to use prosody to mean intonation, or to use intonation to mean F0. So, as I mentioned, F0 has many uses, and we will start here with the paralinguistic uses, the ones that skirt linguistic structure. Specifically, when we say paralinguistic uses, we mean changes in pitch that show anger, boredom, excitement, and the like. There could be also other changes as in duration, for instance, and intensity. These elements are often referred to as emotional prosody, though personally I would prefer to use the term prosody for linguistic purposes only. Now, so paralinguistic changes are continuous when it comes to intonation and include changes in two dimensions, if you like. One is pitch dynamism, which refers to how frequent and dramatic changes are in pitch. The other is pitch range, which includes, again, two elements. On the one hand, pitch level, how low or high the speaker's pitch is. And the other is pitch span, the extent of the frequencies covered. Thus, two speakers may have the same pitch span of, say, 200 hertz, but one may have a high level, so they may have frequencies that extend from 2 to 400 hertz, whereas the other uses a low level of, say, 75 to 275 hertz. Note that these changes may also have social linguistic dimensions, such as performing gender. And we can see this in the video clip here, which is from Say Yes to the Dress.
Okay, I'm gonna cry, but I don't want to mess up my makeup.
Okay, so what we can see in this video is a person who displays a lot of excitement in ways that are appropriate for an American woman from the South. But note that in addition to having this very high-pitched and loud voice to show excitement, she uses the same intonation system that she would use if she was angry or if she was bored. And this system is the same that she shares with the other speakers of her variety. Okay, so as mentioned, F0 has also linguistic uses, and these are both lexical and post-lexical. We'll start here with the lexical uses, which are often referred to by their terms lexical tone and lexical pitch accents. When we talk about lexical uses of F0, what we mean is F0 patterns that apply to words and change the meaning of words. And two classic examples of that are Mandarin and Japanese. We can see some examples of these here. On the left, you have Mandarin tone, and on the right, Japanese lexical pitch accent. If we look at the Mandarin example, we see that we have segmentally the same syllable, ma, which is produced with different pitch patterns, the black lines in the graph. And this changes the meaning of the words.
Ma, 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 ma.
In Japanese, on the other hand, we have lexical pitch accent in about 35% of the vocabulary. So what happens here is that you don't have a pitch specification for every syllable, but for some of the vocabulary, there is one syllable that is accented with lexical pitch accent and shows a fall in pitch. That applies to the first syllable of chopsticks, the second syllable of bridge, but to no syllable in edge.
Hashi, hashi, hashi.
So, as mentioned, F0 has also another paralinguistic use, post-lexical use, which is what we know as intonation. So, intonation, to be more precise, refers to language-specific and systematic modulations of F0 that have two characteristics. First, they span entire utterance, or their domain is not the word, but the utterance. Second, they have some type of grammatical function, and the ones that we know pertain to most languages include marking phrasal boundaries and encoding pragmatic information. The boundaries come from the prosodic metrical structure we mentioned earlier, And the second part is the one that is perhaps the most interesting in many respects. So intonation encodes pragmatic information of various types. It can encode modalities. So very often we hear that intonation can be used to indicate whether an utterance is a question or a statement. Intonation can also show focus. And for me, the most interesting part, it can encode implicatures. This is the part where you would say it's not what you said, but how you said it. Where it's not things that are being said, but how you use intonation to imply certain meanings. Okay, and we can see that in the examples shown here. On the left, you have examples from English, and on the right, examples from Greek. In both cases, you have essentially the same phrase, which is my ex, and in Greek, o proin mu, ton proin mu. Okay, and at the two top examples show you these phrases as a response to who's that. So just presenting new information, who's that, my ex. Whereas the ones at the bottom indicate that the speaker is rather incredulous and queries something they found out, specifically that their partner has invited their ex to their birthday party. Okay, so it's me speaking, so I will illustrate the examples. At the top, we have my ex, o proin mu. Okay, and we can see that we have simple false. Now, if you look at the bottom examples, we see that in English, you have arise, my ex, whereas in Greek, you would say to proin mu. So they're very different contours in this case, right? Note that what the meaning of the phrase does not change. What changes is the pragmatics, what you intend to convey by using this phrase. Two more lessons that we can learn from this is that intonation differs by language, even when we're expressing the same pragmatic meaning. So let's get over the myth that all questions end in rises. If you look at the questions in Greek, you can see that while the English one ends in rise, the Greek one ends in a very decided fall. Okay. Furthermore, what these examples show you is that it is possible to separate the linguistic and the paralinguistic uses of F0, though they're not mutually exclusive in production. So, for example, languages that use F0 for lexical purposes, like tone, also have intonation. In addition, one can be bored or surprised when querying something. So I could have shown extra surprise in saying my ex by raising my pitch even more. However, one thing that I cannot do is use the Greek tune in English. Okay, so I have to use the linguistic structure of my language and then change things like my pitch range to show things like surprise. So now we've gone through this introductory part. Let's recap some things about some myths and what research shows. One of these myths is that intonation is similar across languages, and this is due to the fact that it's based on biological characteristics. Although there is some base to that, this kind of approach confounds intonation with F0 and with, to a large extent, paralinguistic F0 uses. So it's better not to go down that route. In addition, we often hear that particular tunes have particular meanings. So we use phrases like question intonation. We should see this as a shorthand, but bearing in mind that the relationship between tune and meaning is many to many. In other words, what is used, the tune that is used with questions can be used for other purposes as well, and not all questions in a given language will produce with just one tune. A related point is that intonation has to do with affect or with emotion. As I mentioned earlier, again, this myth confuses intonation and paralinguistic uses of F0. I will say it again, we can use the same intonation whether we're happy, sad, or excited. And what changes in order to show these items is continuous aspects of F0, such as our pitch range and dynamism. But we cannot change the structure that is language specific. Finally, a related point that we hear, especially when people work with so-called emotional prosody, is the assumption that intonation can be switched on and off. So, for example, we sometimes read that the researchers instruct participants to speak without intonation. It is simply impossible to speak without intonation. When we speak, we have to phonate, and when we phonate, we produce F0. And this F0 is going to have the structure that is appropriate for our language. In other words, intonation. Now, moving on to talk about intonation, now that we've clarified the points in general, a main challenge that we have here is how to determine the number and nature of a tune's components. And I will explain why we need to see components. Now, this is not an easy task because an F0 curve like the one you see here does not have natural breaks. The breaks that you see are just have to do with voicelessness, so they don't help us at all. We can juxtapose that to what we find when we look, for example, at a spectrogram. Even if you're not a trained phonetician, you can see natural changes in the signal. And that can help you figure out what is going on. Now, because of this particular challenge in intonation, we have several theories that assume that tunes do not have components. They see them, in other words, as configurations or gestalts, as one big blob. And I would like to say a little bit about why that does not work. Why are pitch contours not configurations? Because we know that they vary substantially from instance to instance, and yet listeners can recognize them as instances of the same tune. We can illustrate this with the two examples that you see here. On the left, you have
a ballet dancer,
and on the right,
Lee.
And as if you hear them, you can understand that they mean the same thing. They're both appropriate responses to your hearing the news that Lee, who you've always considered to be a klutz, has actually become a ballet dancer. And you show your incredulity with this tune. Now, although we feel that the response that you're given is the same whether you use the long or the short utterance, we note that there are differences in the tunes themselves. A most striking difference is that in a ballet dancer, we have this low F0 stretch, which is missing from the short utterance Li, where we have only a very quick dip that is not very low either. So because we have these differences between the tunes, it is not possible to see tunes as gestalts and consider them as if they were an accordion that we can shrink or stretch to fit particular utterances. What we actually find in research is that tunes display systematic changes that can be explained by parameters such as utterance length and the position of stressed syllables. We can illustrate that by taking the short tune, Li, and stretching it over the long utterance. This is a little bit similar to what is happening in the British school, where you learn to produce particular tunes on monosyllabic words like yes or no. Now, as you can see, when I stretch the red curve, it doesn't look like the original curve, and they do not sound the same either. So here's the original again.
A ballet dancer.
And here is the stretched out version.
A ballet dancer.
Okay, so this sounds decidedly odd. It doesn't sound natural, and it seems to query a little bit whether Ali has become a ballet dancer as opposed to a jazz dancer, which is not the intended meaning in this particular instance. So based with that, we can actually see what are the main challenges that we face, the main type of research questions that we have to answer. How is it possible that speakers of a given language can determine which contours are instances of the same tune? And how do they learn to produce these tunes with segmental material of varying lengths and structures? Clearly, they must be extrapolating some essential properties of the tunes and know how to manipulate them to create new tunes. Answering these questions is, of course, essential for linguistics. This is what we do as linguists when we do research on intonation, but it is also useful for speech technology as it helps achieve natural sounding speech and pragmatically felicitous intonation. Now, you can say, well, we can do that with big data. That's true, but large amounts of data are not available for all languages. So understanding how these things work and from smaller corpora is also very useful. Now, there are various approaches to these challenges that I mentioned, and I would like to briefly say a few things about some of them. On the one hand, we have some traditional methods. You may be familiar with some of them, especially if you come from an applied linguistics background. You may be familiar with the British school, for example. In models like that, pitch contours are idealized. So basically, you have graphic representations that are like smoothed out versions of the F0 curves you will get from Pratt. The problem with those is that because the detail is removed, you cannot actually use them for modeling. On the other hand, we have models like Penta that are based precisely on, focused on modeling phonetic detail. The problem with models like that is because they don't abstract away from the phonetic detail, they make it very difficult to generalize and predict the shape of contours under different circumstances. Different circumstances being things like how long an utterance is, where the stress syllables are, how the phrasing works, and so on. So instead, we will be looking at the autosegmental-metrical theory of intonational phonology because it actually provides answers to these essential questions. I stress that this is a phonological theory. I put it there in red because the aim is to show that this is a theory that abstracts away from the phonetic detail. However, it also addresses how its phonological abstract representations can be phonetically realized. So it gives us the best of both worlds, if you like. A few things I want to stress before we start on AM is that AM is basically a couple of disclaimers. AM is not the same as Toby. Very often the two are used again interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Toby is a family of systems for the prosodic annotation of speech corpora based on AM. So Toby is nothing exotic or cryptic, it's just a series of text grids that you can put on your underneath your files in Pratt, of course, in a systematic manner. Toby annotation systems are language specific, so there's no universal Toby. Criticisms like I cannot use Toby because the language I work with is tonal, for example, do not apply. Toby systems can be adapted to any language. But the critical point is that they require an existing AM analysis of the language. It is also possible to use them in the back and forth to help you create an analysis, but it's not an off-the-shelf system that you can use and apply to any language. So to recap, neither AM nor Toby are the IPA equivalents of intonation. They're not transcription systems of intonation. So let's unpack the name of the theory and understand how it works. Why does it have this mouthful of a term? Starting with autosegmental. Why is it called autosegmental? Because the primitives of intonation are considered to be tones, and specifically lows and highs, which we show with an L and an H. These tones are autosegments, that is, autonomous segments. What this name implies is that the tones are independent of vowels and consonants, though they have to co-occur with them to be realized. But they're not part of the specification of the syllable, for example, as they are in penta. Okay, they are entirely autonomous part of the representation of an utterance. Now, tones are concatenated in strings like the one shown here to create melodies. Okay, you put one next to the other to create the entire tune. So to give an example, what configurationally, for example, the British school may be described as a fall, in AM is broken down into three elements that together create the same melody. A high star accent, which gives you the little rise at the beginning, and two low edge tones at the end that give you the fall and low level stretch. And we will go in more detail about how we actually do this. Now, the other part of the term is the metrical part. What does that mean? It means that we need a metrical structure. This is very important because in many other theories, the focus is only on the pitch contour. Whereas in AM, it is important to remember that you don't just look at the pitch contour, but how it relates to the metrical structure. This metrical structure is independent of the language's intonation. Okay? And it encodes two main things: strength relations among constituents and the position of boundaries. Okay? To give a very simple example, in an utterance like platypus is a mammal, not a bird, I have one intonational phrase, the one that's shown with a capital IP, which is broken down into two intermediate phrases. Platypus is a mammal, not a bird. Okay? And in this structure, I have three strong syllables: the stress syllable of platypus, the stress syllable of mammal, and the syllable of bird. Okay? And there is a relationship between the three of them. We will see that in the following slides. So why do we need both? Because according to AM, tones associate with heads, informally stressed syllables, and edges of metrical constituents. And then they are synchronized with them in speech, something that is known as the tune-text association. That's why you need both. You cannot have just the tune, because if you have just the tune, you don't know how it needs to be realized relative to the vowels and the consonants in your utterance. So how exactly do these two things connect? This is information that is actually included in the autosegmental representation of the melody. So how does that work? First of all, because we recognize there are different types of tones. One type are the pitch accents. The pitch accents are, you know that they are pitch accents because they have this magic star next to them. Pitch accents associate with the heads of metrical constituents and synchronize with them. Roughly, we can say they will co-occur with stressed syllables. Okay, I've shown you here a number of different representations with pluses, without pluses, with brackets. It doesn't really matter for this very brief presentation. Just don't be deterred by seeing those things. They're pretty much the same thing. In addition to pitch accents, we have edge tones. Remember that we have tones that associate with boundaries, phrasal edges. And these tones come typically in two flavors. On the one hand, we have boundary tones. These are the ones that everybody agrees on, that associate with the boundaries of intonational phrases. And they are expected to be realized on the nearest tone-bearing unit. So if your utterance ends in a vowel, that's your last tone-bearing unit, and you'd expect that if the utterance has a high boundary tone associated with the right edge of the intonational phrase, that vowel is going to be high. Okay? We always have boundary tones on the right edge, sometimes on the left edge as well. In addition to boundary tones, a system may include phrase accents, which are associated with the boundaries of intermediate phrases. In many languages, they fill the gap between the last pitch accent and the boundary tone, and we will see some examples of that from English. However, I should note that not all AM analyses involve this level of phrasing. Now, I talked a little bit vaguely about metrical structures, but here are a couple of examples. These are simplified examples for illustration purposes. So let's say that we have the same utterance, which is here, the same phrase rather, platypus is a mammal, but it is used in response of two different prompts. In the first one, somebody says, name a mammal, and you answer, platypus is a mammal. Okay. In the second one, you're asked, is platypus a bird? And you answer, platypus is a mammal. Okay. So you can see that the tune changes where the focus of this utterance is. And this is indicated in the prosodic structure that you see above. So in both cases, we have a number of syllables, the Greek sigma, with little s and w's next to them to show which ones are weak and which ones are strong. These are grouped into feet. The feet are grouped into prosodic words, and in this particular case, we have just one intermediate phrase that is isomorphic with the intonational phrase. What is of particular interest to us here is the fact that when we look at the prosodic word level, we see that the strength relationship is reversed in the two utterances. In platypus is a mammal, the strong prosodic word is platypus, and it is the last strong prosodic word in this phrase. Whereas in platypus is a mammal, it is mammal that is the strong prosodic word. And this has consequences about the tune that will be used and how it will be implemented. So what is this tune? At an abstract level, it is the string that you see in red, which is separated from the prosodic structure by broken lines. The aim of these broken lines is to indicate that, in fact, you're on a different plane. Okay? So you can think of the, and to show that, I will simplify it by just saying that what this does is to tell you that the prosodic structure and the tune are independent of one another. Okay. Now we need to connect the two, and we need to explain why we have different tunes in this case. So if we start on the left, we see that the tune has only one pitch accent because our last strong word is the first one, so there cannot be an accent on the second word here. Instead, we have only boundary tones and edge tones. So the low high pitch accent is associated, and again I'm simplifying the formal part, with the stress syllable of the word platypus, and the low phrase accent and low boundary tone associate with the intermediate and intonational phrase respectively. Okay, and this is shown with these lines. Okay, if we move to the prosodic structure on the right, however, now the last strong prosodic word is mammal. This means that we can have an optional high star accent on the first word, platypus. This is optional. I will not go into all the details, but it could be missing. Okay, and again, we expect these accents to be associated with stress syllables, and then we have the same low edge tones associated with intermediate and intonational phrase boundary. Okay, now how does this play out in practice with actual F0 contours? We can see this here. I can play the examples for you.
Platypus is a mammal.
Platypus is a mammal.
Okay. So on the left, we have platypus is a mammal. On the right, platypus is a mammal, right? So, and you can see in the text grids that you actually have the AM representation at the bottom. Remember that in platypus, we have a low-high accent on platypus, and we actually see a rise, shown here in red, at the top of, on the stress syllable of platypus. We have low edge tones and we have no other accents. So in fact, what is happening here is that the low phrase accent actually spreads to fill the empty space here. Note that we also have a fall in this case, but this fall is incidental, is only interpolation between the high of the low high accent and the low phrase accent that follows. Again, this is a main difference with a model like Penta, for example, where you have to specify every syllable for F0. That does not happen here. And here you have the key for the three different elements. Now, if we move to the tune on the right, what we see is that we now have two accents. So we have high F0 on the first syllable and low high on the first syllable of mammal. Note that in this case, the low edge tones are now realized very differently than they were before, because they have to both be realized on the very short second syllable of mammal, which is pretty much just a syllabic L for the speaker. So what we see here is, instead of having a low level stretch, we actually have a quick fall. On the other hand, we have a different type of interpolation here, which is already starting on the first syllable of platypus, where we see that the speaker is falling very gradually until he reaches the beginning, the low level at the beginning of mammal for the low high accent. Now, what this example is meant to show you is how you can have how the representations from AM can be converted into actual F0, and how AM can actually make predictions that these things will be different. So, for instance, we can predict particularly well that the realization of the edge tones in platypus is a mammal will be very different from that in platypus is a mammal. Now, the other thing that this shows you is that the tones in TBUs actually may show mismatches. And this is because the relationship between tones and tone-bearing units in AM is not expected to be one-to-one. We don't expect every vowel or every syllable to be associated with the tone, and that is one of the reasons why we have these very different phonetic realizations. As we saw in the earlier example, in platypus as a mammal, we have a lot of syllables on which the low edge tones can be realized, where in platypus as a mammal, we just have one. This is also illustrated with the example that we saw earlier. If you look at this example, you see that both tunes have the same phonological AM representation, and this captures the fact that we understand these tunes to mean the same thing, to be used for the same purpose. But we can also see that there are mismatches between the number of tones and TBUs. If you look at Li, we have many more tones than TBUs. We have only one vowel and 4 tones. This is known in AM as tonal crowding. The result of tonal crowding is there can be various consequences and ways of dealing with that. Here, what we see is that the speaker actually lengthens the vowel very much. You can see that this one syllable is almost 600 milliseconds long, so about half the size of the long utterance, which has 5 syllables. But he also undershoots the low phrase accent, which, as you can see, is relatively high if we compare it with the low in a ballet dancer. Okay. In ballet dancer, on the other hand, we have more TBUs. We have 5 TBUs and 4 tones, and that allows the low to spread. Now, in AM, we don't talk in general terms, as I've been talking about so far, about how tones and TBUs synchronize. We actually have stronger versions of the theory, according to which tones are actually realized as tonal targets. The idea of tonal targets is that they are specific points in an F0 contour, and they have consistent scaling and alignment. Scaling is the value of a tonal target in F0 or pitch scale, and alignment is the way in which it relates with a segmental string. So you may say, for example, that a particular high will appear in the middle of the accented vowel, or it will appear at the end of the accented vowel. And usually we expect 1 target per tone. So, for example, in Li, we have 4 tonal targets, all of which have to be realized on 1 syllable. In a ballet dancer, we have 5 tonal targets, one for the low and the high of the low star high accent, and 1 for the high boundary tone. But we can argue that we have 2 tonal targets for the low phrase accent because that accent spreads, and it spreads in very specific ways. So this concludes this first part, the theoretical part about AM. And a brief recap is here as follows. AM is a theory of intonational phonology so it abstracts away from phonetic detail. Its aim is to represent the elements that are contrastive in an intonation system. These elements are tones, which form strings of autosegments, which represent melodies. These tones associate with structural positions in metrical structure, that is, with the heads of constituents in formally stresses and with phrasal boundaries. When this abstract system is to be realized in speech, what we find is that tones are synchronized with the constituents they are associated with phonologically. So pitch accents synchronize with stress syllables. They appear roughly on the stress syllables. Boundary tones synchronize with utterance final and sometimes with utterance initial syllables, and phrase accents tend to spread between the last pitch accent and the boundary tone. In this theory, intonation is seen as part of a language's phonology, and thus it is language specific, and I'll show you examples which very clearly show that it cannot be otherwise. So AEM is not meant to provide a transcription of actual F0 contours. We will be using F0 contours in the rest of the tutorial, and we will show you how you can explore these contours in a number of different ways. Thank you.
Okay, so we've had the presentation now. If there are any questions, you can either put them on the chat, or I assume you can actually speak. I'm not sure. Okay. Okay. All right, then one of the things that we can do is have a break if there are no presentations, and start again at 12 o'clock, I guess. Yeah.
Hello everyone, I'm Kathleen Jepson, presenting the second part of our tutorial. Welcome back. I'll be playing the second part video in just a moment, but I thought I would let you know that there is the chat function which we're monitoring. If you have a question throughout, we'll try and respond as we go. It's the question function. Sorry, question chat function, there's a question mark. And at the end of the session, we'll make voice asking questions. We'll turn on the microphone option so you're able to ask a question then if you'd like as well. Okay, so I'll share my screen and see you on the other side. Welcome back everyone to our tutorial on intonation transcription and modelling in research and speech technology applications. We're on to part 2. In this section, we'll be looking at some annotation methods and tools to explore intonation data. As Amalia discussed, through an AM analysis, we may arrive at a phonological analysis of the intonation system of the language. To annotate the intonation of an utterance, Toby-style systems have been developed. Toby stands for tone and break indices and was developed by a group of researchers in the early 1990s. It was first developed for transcribing the intonation patterns and other aspects of prosody in English. However, the term Toby has now evolved to refer to a general framework for the development of prosodic annotation systems. There are now Toby systems for a wide variety of languages. The tones part refers to tone labels that represent the intonational phonology. The break index part is a numerical value that represents the metrical hierarchy of the prosodic groupings in an utterance, and it indicates the perceived degree of juncture between each word in the utterance. Together, the tonal event and break index information describes 2 essential parts of the prosodic system of a language. In the Toby framework, the fundamental frequency contour is an obligatory representation, so you'll see contours along with various annotations in this part of the presentation. These Toby annotations are based on 4 tiers. The first tier is the tone tier. This is where distinctive pitch events are transcribed as a sequence of high and low tones. And then there are diacritics, which can indicate their function as a boundary tone or as a pitch accent. Then there's the orthographic tier, where words are orthographically represented. The break index tier, where the end of each word is labelled for the subjective strength of its association with the following word. This is the perceived degree of juncture. And there's a miscellaneous tier for notes and such. Let's take a look at some examples of Toby annotations of the intonational phonology of a number of languages. Here we have examples of 2 utterances. The top is from Lebanese Arabic and the bottom is from Bari Italian. If we look here, there is a similar shape in F0. We have a rise followed by a fall, and both are phonologically labelled H star, high star, and this is associated with the first word. However, things don't always match up. The same phonological representation does not always result in the same phonetics. Take, for example, this utterance from Jamaican Creole and German. On the left in our Jamaican Creole example, we have a low plus high star pitch accent, likewise in German. However, we can see that in the Jamaican Creole example, the rise is slow and it starts 3 syllables before the accented word, whereas in German, the rise is sharp and occurs only on the accented syllable. Considering these pitch contours, what we would expect to have in common in this bitonal pitch accent with the low and the high tones is that there's a point where the pitch is relatively low and a point where the pitch is relatively high. And that's what we do observe in both of these examples, though the exact nature of the rise is different. There are also instances where similar intonational phenomena are analysed differently across languages. Take, for example, this utterance in Dutch and this in Greek. In both, there is a rise, fall shape. However, in Dutch, this is analysed as a fall with the high star low pitch accent, and the rise is taken account of by the initial low boundary tone. While in Greek, this is analysed as a rise with the low plus high star pitch accent, and the fall is taken account of by the low phrase tone. That is to say, while these two languages have similar phonetic forms, the phonological system of each language determines the label associated with that form. So, how do we start to develop an AM analysis of a language or a language variety? From a linguistics perspective, understanding some of the basics of a language is a good place to start. Some things you might want to consider are, what's the word level prosody? Does the language have lexical tones? Does it have stress? What's known about the metrical structure of the language? And this may be important when considering where tonal events are associated, as Amalia mentioned. Does the language have fixed word order, or is it relatively free? And how are syntactic arguments marked? Also, how is focus marked? Is there a morphological marker, or is there a special syntactic position? As the examples I've already shown demonstrate, the intonational inventory of one language cannot easily be applied to another language, and possibly not even another variety of the same language. That's to say, no two languages necessarily have the same intonational units. For example, as Amalia mentioned, the intermediate phrase is not used in all AM analyses, and no two languages need have the same representations of similar pitch contours, as I demonstrated just before. The representations or the labels should make sense within the phonological system for the language under investigation. Take, for example, these pitch accents for these 4 Italian varieties. These are used to mark declarative broad focus and contrastive focus, yes, no question, broad and contrastive focus, as well as continuation. If we look down the columns for these 4 varieties, we can see that no two varieties use the same pitch accents for each of these functions. This is most strikingly evident for the Florence variety in the rightmost column, which indeed uses a high for most functions. So when developing an analysis, then your primary aim should be to keep your analysis as simple as possible. It should be able to take into account possible sources of variation without the need to posit special tones that phonetically describe the variation. Some sources of variability may be from additional languages that the speaker knows, or sociolinguistic factors that determine how individuals interact with others in their community. And of course, there's intonation-specific sources of variability, such as tonal context. This is perhaps considering a pitch accent's proximity to another pitch accent or a boundary. Interactions with stress, which may affect the phonetics of a tone. Also the segmental context, for example, the effect of voiceless segments on the realization of pitch. As well as taking into account of variability, the analysis should be able to capture meaningful contrasts, for example, that relate to pragmatics or information structure or sentence type. Take, for example, these 2 utterances in Greek, for which the last word either is new information occurring with a high star, or contrastive information occurring with the low high star. So here we have an example of a difference in phonetics that corresponds with a difference in meaning. And this needs to be captured by the intonational phonology. There are many types of speech data that we may collect and investigate in an intonational analysis. Often, analyses have been based on uniform data, such as read speech, like read texts or sentences, discourse completion tasks, or semi-spontaneous games and tasks. However, this has led to a perceived importance of uniformity, as well as the expectation of uniformity in intonation. This has also meant a focus on the phonetic form of the pitch contours, and somehow that these fully represent the intonational phonology, which they don't. However, there are, of course, valid reasons that one might want to use controlled data to answer specific questions. For example, controlled data can help us understand how lexical prosody and metrical structure affect intonational tunes, and may also allow us to investigate why and how surface structures appear different. If user-controlled data, we can also manipulate a number of aspects we think might affect the intonation, most of which are things we've discussed before, like word structure or accent proximity. So when collecting data and analysing data, here are some tips. Try to adapt the tasks you're using to the local context. This might be using pictures that are of familiar objects, using objects that are familiar to people, using a local game, and considering people's familiarity with structured tasks. Maybe adapt them. Don't just rely on read speech, consider using games to elicit more natural speech as well. Explore data that's from a wide variety of styles if you can, like collecting narratives, procedural texts, dialogues, in conversations with a range of interlocutors. And if your analysis, if you've already collected data, try to analyse sentences with different modalities, such as statements, types of questions, imperatives. Also consider the information structure of the utterance, investigating focus, different types of focus may be of interest, and to see how givenness is marked as well. So when it comes to determining the representations, that is developing the intonational inventory, there's a few things to consider. Firstly, phonetic evidence, such as a high tone being used to represent a pitch that is high in the melody with respect to the individual speaker's range, as well as high compared with other tones in the same contour. While low might be motivated by a low pitch with respect to the speaker's range, as well as low compared with surrounding tones. Phonological considerations or system internal considerations may be related to differences in meaning being conveyed by different melodies that then require different phonological representations. So a rise may not be need to be specified in an inventory if it's not used contrastively with, say, a high plateau point. However, if a rise and a high plateau do indicate differences in information structure, for example, then you would posit two different pitch accents to indicate the two tones, one that would perhaps include a low followed by a high to indicate the rise, while the other may just be a plain high. However, phonological representations of intonation don't need to be phonetically transparent. Take, for example, this utterance from Greek Thrace Romani. Here we have 5 examples of high star, and each is phonetically different in shape. On this topic, Arvaniti writes that the high star can take several forms. It can be a rise, a high, a plateau, or a fall, and that's what we see across these examples. So in sum, when developing an analysis, we want to keep it simple, positing tones where we have reason to do so, but doing our best to take into account variation. We can look at variation by considering different data from different speakers, different tasks, in which different sentence modalities are used, and where information structure varies. We want the representations to reflect meaningful differences for which there's also phonetic evidence. Different meanings do not necessarily have to be different tones, however, and the phonological representations, while informed by the phonetics, don't have to be completely transparent either. So, on to the tools. So far, we've been considering how to develop an analysis for a language for which there isn't one, or developing an analysis for a variety that hasn't been described yet. But even if you have developed an analysis or you're working on a language for which there is already an analysis, there might be system guidelines and training. Prosodically annotating a corpus is still a challenging task. Some of the reasons for this is that cues are ambiguous in the F0 contour, for example. There's also variation, as we discussed, and this is including between speakers, for example. Transcribers often need to be trained and have knowledge of the system as well as detailed guidelines that can help them. Though often guidelines do not address the whole range of annotation challenges that are commonly encountered by a transcriber. However, if we do consider intonational analysis and annotation from another perspective, phonetically, intonation is neither invariable, where we would expect the same phonological representation to have the same phonetic form in all cases, nor is it more or less variable than segmentals. So some advice if you are going to pursue hand annotating a corpus, you're developing an analysis for an under-described language. If you encounter a tricky situation, consider what you would do if you're annotating segments. However, now we're going to look at some tools and methods that have been designed to speed up the annotation process or allow for the investigation of the intonation without trained annotators. We'll take a look at 5 different ones now. So the first tool we're looking at is Autobi, which was developed by Andrew Rosenberg and presented at Interspeech back in 2010. It's a system to automatically hypothesize the presence and type of prosodic events in a spoken utterance. It automatically detects and classifies the breaks and tones within standard American English data. This means that it uses phonetic cues to find pitch accents and boundary tones and is trained on data so that it can hypothesize the labels, so the pitch accent label or the boundary tone label that are associated with these particular events. The system has been used to explore prominence in French, German and Italian as well, that is using the prominence cues from American English on these other languages. However, the system can be trained to work with data from other languages, which we'll discuss later on. And of course, you can use this trained system on other languages as it is. To get started using Autobi, you can download it from Andrew Rosenberg's GitHub. The link is on the previous slide. If you're working on American English, there's a few files that you'll need for your corpus. You need to have WAV files as well as corresponding prior text grids, and in the text grids, the words need to be segmented. Autobi then extracts a number of measures, including pitch, and this is the mean, the minimum, the maximum, a number of features. The details are in the Interspeech paper. Also intensity, spectral balance, as well as pause and other duration features. It then automatically generates labels going through 6 steps, and this process is visualized here. So the grey boxes represent user input, the black boxes represent the system's output, and the white boxes are the internal modules. These 6 steps are listed here as well. Firstly, there's the detection of pitch accents and the classification of pitch accent types. So detection is using the phonetic cues to identify which words may be pitch accented. And the classification is assigning one of the Toby labels. The detection of intonational phrase boundaries and intermediate phrase boundaries is next, and then their classification. So that is again assigning the appropriate Toby label. These are run on each word, and the hypotheses are resolved before the output is generated. And this is why you need to have in your text grids each word segmented. The outcomes of this process is that you have text grids in which pitch accents and boundary tones are identified in terms of their location. And if you're working on American English, this is done with reasonable accuracy for both pitch accents and boundaries, though boundaries more so at about 90%. And then those accents and boundaries are classified, that is, they're given a Toby label. The labels will have to be evaluated and corrected by a trained transcriber or researcher, but this process overall could speed up the intonational analysis part of the project in a similar way to force alignment tools can for segments. So this is a tool that could be used if you're working on American English and have a corpus of WAV files and can create the appropriate text grid files. Next up is Polar. POLAR stands for points, levels, and ranges, and it's an annotation system for intonation developed by Byron Ann, Nanette Viau, Stephanie Shattuck-Hufnagel, and Elena Burgos. They describe POLAR annotations as being phonologically informed labeling of acoustic phonetic cues that's not tied to any particular theory. It's been designed to facilitate the labeling process and to be used by annotators with a wide range of experiences and also those who have different research goals. Labelers require minimal theoretical knowledge, which means that a novice labeler can annotate in the POLAR system relatively quickly. The goals of POLAR, as they state them in the guidelines, are to annotate a wider array of prosodically relevant features of the speech signal than is possible in existing systems, to isolate different prosodically relevant aspects of the speech signal from one another, and to make labeling easier by requiring fewer phonological decisions on the part of the annotator. So let's take a look. To get started with POLAR, you can download the guidelines, which are available on the POLAR website, linked to on the previous slide. Once you get annotating, there are 4 tiers that you will use, and these are in part text grids. One annotator can annotate across all the tiers, or different people can specialize in annotating the different tiers. Here we have an example of a POLAR annotation. These are the relevant tiers. The first tier is, it encodes the prosodic structure. It's the prosodic structure tier in which perceived prosodic prominences are indicated using the star. Though this is a familiar annotation, so star in AM notes pitch accents. In this, no label is ascribed. On the second tier, the pitch turning points are indicated. That is the high and the low points. Here you can see that they are marked with the zeros. The third tier marks the level of each turning point within that pitch range domain. This is a process that they say can be automated. And the fourth tier is an annotation of the range domain. So this is where you can see that there are 2 parts annotated on this tier in this example. The first part has relatively higher range, while the second part has a compressed range. From this process, the researcher gets labelled text grids that enable the exploration of how variation within prosody relates to variation in the context. And this can be used to further develop phonological analyses, but also understand the phonetics of phonological categories. This is mainly developed for American English, but this process of separately annotating different parts of the speech signal could be applied to other languages as well. And they do say that transcribers can be trained up in this system relatively quickly, and as I mentioned, require little theoretical knowledge. The next method up is rapid prosodic transcription, or RPT. It was developed by Jennifer Cole and Stephanie Shattuck-Hufnagel, and is also a system for minimally annotating aspects of intonation. In RPT, listeners identify prominences and boundaries in 2 different tasks based on their auditory impressions of an utterance. RPT can capture inter-transcriber differences in annotation, and then this can be used in other investigations, for example, looking at the cues that result in one transcriber perceiving a prominence where another does not, and can offer new insights into the interaction between the prosodic form of an utterance and its function. And in RPT's favour, it can be performed by any person with functioning hearing and vision, and transcribers do not need training. They only need knowledge of the target language, and this is to be able to identify relevant words. Let's take a look at how it works. The RPT method is relatively simple for the transcriber. And for the researchers, Tim Mart has developed a software to present the speech samples in a fashion appropriate for RPT, which you can download from his GitHub, and the link is on the previous slide. In RPT, the transcriber's task is to listen to a speech sample and read through an orthographic transcription at the same time. On the right, we have an example of an annotated speech sample, but it gives you an idea of what the transcribers are looking at. The transcriber marks the prominent words and boundaries in real time, and this is done as two different tasks. They're given the following instructions. Mark as prominent words that the speaker has highlighted for the listener to make them stand out. Mark boundaries between words that belong to different chunks that serve to group words in a way that helps listeners interpret the utterance. Let's take a look at this example and have a listen.
Well, it could have been prevented, but we didn't know it was going to happen, that our society was going to change so intensely, and we kind of hung back and thought things would stay the same way they were, and they haven't. And everybody's changing, and especially the younger people.
So for this particular utterance, for this particular transcriber, they've marked the words could, no, happen, so the red words, as being prominent to them. And they've marked there being boundaries between prevented and but, happened and that, intensely and so on. This is just one example. Other listeners would also have transcribed this same audio file, and they may have marked similar or different words as being accented and put boundaries in the same or in different places. Some other things to note are that speech samples can be 10 to 60 seconds long, and transcribers are not given an example of a transcription, so they don't see anything like this before commencing their own transcribing, nor are they given any feedback on how their transcriptions are going. The outcomes of RPT are that each word is given a prominence score and a boundary score, and this reflects inter-transcriber agreement. And these can be used in the process of identifying phonological prosodic categories. Secondly, RPT annotations could be used to investigate factors that influence the perception of prominences and boundaries, such as phonetic and structure factors. And these have been investigated in, of course, American English, as well as German and Papuan Malay. And so this system has the potential to be expanded and used for a variety of languages. The next tool up is the Automatic Analysis of Speech Prosody tool developed by Na Hu, Berit Janssen, Judith Hansen, Carlos Jussenhoven, and Aljur Chen. It's a tool for the automatic annotation and analysis of speech prosody. The analysis module can be used with any language, and the annotation portion is currently available for Dutch with the potential to be expanded for other languages. But what are these two modules? There's the Fpca module, in which a functional principal component analysis of pitch contours is performed, and this is something that Katherine will pick up in much more detail later on. And the other module is Autobi, which is the Dutch implementation of a Autobi system, using the Autobi method developed by Andrew Rosenberg. It predicts the prosodic events and labels within the Dutch Toby style annotation system. And the latest news from Na Hu is that this tool is currently being developed as a web service, so online, rather than the Docker container, which is described in the interspeech paper. The Docker container is no longer supported on their web server, so we're all holding out for the web service to be made available. So how does it work? Well, there are two tasks, and these can each be picked as different modules, as is demonstrated in this picture. For the Autobi module, it requires WAV files and text grids with words segmented. This is the same as Autobi, which I described before. It also follows the Autobi workflow. A special model has been trained for Dutch, so it is looking for particular phonetic features that are relevant for Dutch and using the Dutch Autobi framework for assigning labels. For the Fpca module, it requires WAV files again, text grids again, but this time slightly different things are annotated. So here we have the domain of interest annotated, so this might be the word or prosodic word, and also internal landmarks that are of interest motivated by a researcher's research questions. They need to also be annotated, and Katherine once again will be speaking more about what these internal landmarks may be. In the Fpca workflow, F0 values are extracted, as well as duration values, which are calculated around the particular internal landmarks. The contours are smoothed, and then other processes of Fpca are performed. The outcome of these processes are that you get text grids with the TODI label annotations. This is the same process as Autobi, so boundaries and pitch accents are identified, and then the labels from within the TODI framework are assigned. Secondly, then the Fpca module, you receive a CSV containing the principal component weights for each input curve, but as I mentioned, more Fpca will be coming up soon. So this method is suitable if you're working on Dutch, though as I mentioned, it can be adapted for other languages. However, the Fpca component will be available for people working on any language who have their data in the right format. So this tool is slightly different from the other tools that we've looked at, where an analysis is performed within the tool as well as annotation. The next tool is also performing an analysis. Let's take a look. The last method is contour clustering, which was developed by Constantine Carland, and he published on this earlier this year. This method is an automatic data-driven clustering analysis which can be used to describe prototypical intonation patterns. F0 contours are clustered based on their acoustic form and can be used, and this method can be used on data that is not balanced across categories. This might mean that you don't have an even sample of two different pitch accent categories, but indeed this can be useful if you don't even know what the categories are yet. It's suitable to be used in the initial stages of analysis. So that is, it can be used on a wide range of speech data, including spontaneous speech. It has the potential to reveal meaningful functions of intonation that correspond to phonetic differences by investigating the members of each cluster. So this means that you can investigate each individual curve to see if it shares functions or meanings with other members of the cluster it belongs to. It's performed in Praat, and in R there's a graphical user interface. So let's take a look. To get started with the contour clustering method, you can download everything you need from Constantine Carland's GitHub. Once again, the link is on the previous slide. There's also a lot of information on the website about how to use the tool and information packs guiding you through the process. What you do need for yourself are WAV files and annotated text grids. And in these text grids, they have to have the region of interest labeled. This may be a word, this may be a short phrase, for example. And at a later process, you're able to filter your data so that you look at a homogeneous data set based on duration within a particular range, for example. You then use the Praat script to extract the F0 measures. And then in R, the analysis is performed. There's some flexibility in the tool in that you can modify a number of the settings. This includes, for example, types of normalization that's performed. If you want to perform any, this is on the F0 contours. Changing the number of clusters you're looking for example, and then you can interpret the results visually and with a numerical classification of each curve that corresponds to the contour it belongs to. So when it comes to outcomes, here we can see the raw data plotted at the top for some Papuan Malay noun phrase examples. At the bottom, we have the results of the contour clustering analysis in the bottom 4 panels. In this case, Constantine Carland recommended using 4 clusters as the the number in the analysis, and we can see that this corresponds quite well. He also analyzes spontaneous data from Papuan Malay and Zagawa tone data. So this tool can be used to analyze F0 at the lexical as well as intonation levels. To summarize the outcomes, this method, you receive a numerical value for each curve and a visualization shape for the curves in that cluster. The classifications have the potential to reveal meaningful differences between contours that might be difficult to elicit or are not usually elicited by the types of in the types of data that we may use often in intonational analyses. This tool, as I mentioned, can also be used to investigate lexical tones, for example, and is useful if you are at an early stage and you do not yet have an intonational analysis underway. So let's finish up with an overview of the tools that we just looked at. That's Autobi, Polar, RPT, AASP, and contour clustering. We'll be thinking about some of the things you may need to consider depending on your research question and the tool's applicability to answering your question. Where you are with your analysis. Are you working on a language, for example, for which there already is an intonational analysis? Are you developing an analysis? Or are you working with data from a language for which intonation has not yet been analysed? And of course, thinking about what data you may need to be able to use these tools. Starting off with Autobi, it predicts boundaries and pitch accents and classifies these boundaries and pitch accents for mainstream American English. This is using the mainstream American English Toby system and the Toby labels. The files are minimally annotated that you need to put into the Toby system. You need WAV files and you need text grids that have word segmented. If you would like to use this system for a language other than English and you would like to have the labels annotated, you do require an AM annotated corpus to train the model. That is, you need to still be working on a language that has an AM annotation system described and that has been applied to a corpus of data that you can then use for model training. The categorizations that it outputs, this is for American English, may need to be checked. So while it detects boundaries and pitch accents in their location with quite a high degree of accuracy, the final labels that it associates may need to be checked by an expert annotator to ensure their accuracy. For AASP, it predicts boundaries and pitch accents and classifies boundaries and pitch accents in a similar way to Autobi, but this is of course done for Dutch using the TODI framework, so that's Dutch Toby. The files again need to be minimally annotated, and this system has a second module that performs Fpca, that's functional principal component analyses, and the files required for this are minimally annotated as well, with the domain of interest marked and also landmarks internally that are motivated by your research question. The forthcoming web service is quite exciting, making the Fpca tool available to anyone with data, not necessarily just for Dutch. Currently though, the Autodi part is of course only available for Dutch. And once again, if you're using this, you may need to check over the categorization labels for pitch accents and boundary tones. For Polar, your output are, your results are that cues are annotated and can be compared across transcribers. It reveals phonetic patterns that may have phonological relevance, for example, pitch range. Maybe pitch range, you're considering if pitch range can be a distinguishing feature between two pitch accents or boundary tones. This system may be able to give you an indication or help you in your analysis of these features. Also, it can be used by untrained transcribers, that is people who have not transcribed intonation before and may not have the theoretical knowledge of the intonation system at hand. It does only capture F0 movement and height because of this, and so decisions on the label needs to be made by an expert annotator. So while locations for possible pitch accents are marked, an expert annotator may need to come in to be able to label these. using the relevant analysis system. This framework, though, the polar system, can be used for languages other than English, of course, but once again, you would have to develop your analysis if you want to associate phonological labels with the relevant portions of the contour. For RPT, it has quite accurate boundary recognition across annotators, so if you're interested in investigating boundaries, this could be a tool for you. It allows also for the exploration of the range of cues and cue perception between annotators, as each sample is annotated by a number of people. Once again, these people who are doing the annotating are untrained transcribers, and they also don't need to have further feedback as they're doing their transcription. So this is able to tap into, I guess, lay listeners' perceptions of prominence and boundaries. Prominence agreement, however, is low, but perhaps this is part of your research question, in which case this could be a good tool for you. Decisions on labels will also need to be made by an expert annotator. So if you choose to investigate further the boundaries and pitch accent locations that are marked or agreed upon by different annotators, an expert annotator will have to step in to annotate these for the labels in the Autobi system or of the language that is being investigated. Finally, for contour clustering, it can be performed on controlled or natural data, spontaneous data. The files, yet again, only need to be minimally annotated with the region of interest annotated in text grid, and it has the potential to reveal patterns that reflect phonological categories. However, no analysis of the relevant phonological labels or relevant phonological units is performed through the contour clustering analysis. This is a step that would still need to be made later by the researchers. So to recap this part, when undertaking an intonational analysis, it's helpful to understand the linguistic structure of the language and have knowledge of related languages too, if you're working on an underdescribed language. Consider sources of variation and look at data that can reveal variation. So this is data from various speakers completing different types of tasks. Don't assume that one language's intonational categories are going to be relevant in another language. And aim for a phonological analysis in which categories are meaningful, where variation is accounted for, but don't try to capture all the phonetic features as they may not be relevant phonologically. In terms of tools, these are just a few that have been developed recently within the linguistic space. These are valuable as prosodic annotation by hand can be a challenging task. However, annotation by hand does give researchers a close understanding of the details of their data and can also be helpful in the early stages of analysis in creating the intonational analysis. Fast annotation methods may be fast in part because phonological labels are not annotated, and this is left to an expert annotator. This may or may not be of relevance to answer a particular research question, but is something to be kept in mind. Annotation tools are often designed for one language, though have the potential to be adapted for others. They may require a prosodically annotated corpus for training a new model. Analysis of the phonetics, such as through examining contours as a whole, may lead to the understanding of meaningful differences within different pitch contour shapes, but further analysis may be needed to arrive at a phonological analysis and an annotation system, if that is of interest. This space is developing quickly as there are a number of languages investigated internationally as it increases, so it's a really exciting area to be working in. I'll be available for questions now.
Hello everyone, I think I should be back now. So I will enable the hands up option, and you're welcome to type any questions in the chat. I'll search in the question function. Please put your questions in the question function. Can people see me or nothing? Oh no. Oh, my webcam says it's on. I have stopped sharing. I can start sharing again. Share. Okay, so now if I say stop sharing, no,
You're welcome. There you are.
so I'll say stop sharing, and now my webcam is on. Are people able to see me now, or still not? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sure how to get the webcam option on as I stopped sharing my screen. It says off for me. In any case, as long as you can hear me and I've put the questions on, you're welcome to ask questions. Which of the systems would you recommend for conversational data in a language variety with no description of intonation so far? We have one question. And a second question, do you think inter-rater agreement is a good substitute for expert opinion? Okay, so for conversational data with no description of intonation so far, I think this in part depends on your research question. If you're aiming for a full intonational analysis, so you're aiming to have an AM description, I think that in part annotating by hand would be of benefit to you. I think if you would like to use a tool to help explore your data, the contour clustering could be an option if you want to see if you have data that's organized in a particular pattern. So I would recommend looking at Constantine Carlin's paper to see the types of data that he analyzes himself. When I and Amalia, who's sitting here as well, have started annotations for languages which have no annotation for intonation so far, we have annotated by hand. I've used so starting off using a Toby-like annotation system. So this is keeping it minimal as far as you can go at the beginning, and then saying using highs and lows, and if you then think, maybe there's a shape, it continues to occur, it's a particular fall, then maybe you would start to annotate that, so including more labels as they appear necessary, and there's phonetic, phonological, and meaning reasons that you may do so. That's a whirlwind answer, and I have used conversational data myself in creating a system for Jambrapongo, an Australian Indigenous language, using this method of partly annotating as well. So do you think inter-rater agreement is a good substitute for expert opinion? So this would be to confirm this is labeling the actual the phonological label, so a pitch accent or a boundary tone label. I guess Amalia is going to sidle up as well here.
Hi, I would say that one is not a substitute for the other. So what you want is people who understand what they're doing, and then the inter-rater agreement should be used to see if your labels and your criteria are correct, rather than being used as a substitute for understanding what it is that you are annotating. I think that would be my answer.
Yeah,
I think if sorry, I'm so for a language that are well described, then maybe inter-rater agreement could be an option. But for a language that are under described to begin with, then what are you asking them to agree on? That's an important question that you need to define yourself. There's another question.
I see a third question. Do you know of any work that has compared different transcription systems to one another? Do you think that this would be useful, especially for languages / varieties that are well described? There are papers that compare across different transcription systems. Amalia, do you have?
I don't remember any offhand, but again, as Katie said, one important issue is what you want the system to do. So, for example, if you use an AM system, your aims are probably different from when you're using RPT. In addition, I think one of the important things to remember is that these systems are not competing with one another. They can be complementary. So for example, you could use RPT to try to figure out if the speakers of the language you're interested in can understand differences in prominence, which they may or may not have, depending on the prosodic system of the language. You can also use it to see if they perceive different levels of phrasing. And using that first step, then you can do something like AM, or you can use Polar. So each one of these systems has advantages and disadvantages. So you cannot say there is any correct way or any way of comparing them as such, because they're not meant to be doing the same thing, all of them. Okay, I hope that answers a little bit the question and the difficulties we face with these systems.
I'll wait for a little moment for any further questions. We'll be starting the next video session on the hour, so I'll wait for a little bit more if anyone would like to ask anything else. And then otherwise, I guess we'll see you on the hour. But let's see. Okay, all right. Well, then let's go and grab a cup of tea and see you back in about 9 minutes on the hour.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Before we start the final session for today, we realized there were some questions that came up after the break. So we would like to answer briefly those questions before we move on. And the next presentation is going to be relatively brief, so we'll have even more time for questions after that. So the first question from Anna Sfakianaki is about whether there are any automated annotation tools adapted for Greek. As far as I know, no, there aren't any. And the second question she asked was whether automated tools also work for pathological speech. I don't know that they have used, but I think that would depend a lot on what kind of speech you call pathological. I would be a little bit skeptical about that word. But for example, if we're discussing the speech of somebody who is on the autism spectrum, the differences are likely to be linguistic rather than phonetic. And in that case, I think any automated tool would work. But if somebody has dysarthria, for example, we're talking about a very different type of problem that may have to do more with phonetic implementation, in which case automated tools will not work particularly well. But as Katie mentioned earlier, it is always good practice in the beginning to look at your data, because that will give you a better understanding of how to refine your research questions and choose the appropriate tools for more automated analysis later on. The second question was about the fact that representation intonations are not necessarily transparent, and whether accurate tools will have to include language-specific lexical syntactical structure to account because of that. Again, I would like to stress something that I said at the beginning. There are two levels of analysis. One is a linguistic analysis that has to do with intonation, and another one may be a low-level phonetic analysis that looks at modeling F0. So you have to choose what it is that you're doing. So, and the same applies to the next question about decomposing contours into trajectories that have different segmentation time span. So if your aim is to get somebody to to record sentences, and then what you're trying to do is to model F0, there are many ways to do that. It's a curve. It's not very difficult to model. So use whatever method you think is best. If you're trying to understand and predict contours, so that, for example, when you do TTS, you can tell what is a likely melody to be used with a particular utterance, then having some linguistic principles at work is preferable, in our opinion. And these can work with any modeling of F0 model you want to use. At the same time, none of these models are going to work in exactly the same way as across different languages, because these are models that have the models cannot be for all languages. There are language-specific rules, language-specific phonology, and language-specific phonetic implementation rules. So it's always going to be there's no way to be accurate by just doing modeling without thinking about the structure of the language itself. I hope I have answered these questions, and I'll give the floor to Cong and Katherine now. And as mentioned, please keep asking questions, and don't forget that it is possible to actually email us if you want, or find us on Twitter to ask more questions later. Bye.
Hello, I'm Cong Zhang. And I'm Katherine Marcoux. We're going to present the third part of the whole tutorial. And we're dealing with some messages. Okay. Yeah. The third part is about modeling intonation, and we will. Yeah, we can, of course. So it should be sharing it. Does it work? Yeah.
Hello everyone, my name is Cong Zhang. Today my colleague Katherine and I will be presenting part 3, Modeling Intonation. In this part, we will talk about the methods for modeling F0 and the ways to interpret the data in terms of intonation categories. We will cover Fpca, GAMS, 2D Fpca, and random forests. First, we would like to ask, what is PCA? PCA stands for Principal Component Analysis. As its name suggests, it analyzes the major components in the data. There's a recipe analogy. In a restaurant, you see a course called spring onion chicken on the menu. The principal components of this dish is spring onion and chicken, although there are other ingredients like oil, salt, soy sauce, etc. The first component will be the component that can explain the most of your data. For instance, if one restaurant offers more chicken in the dish, then the PC1 is the chicken. But another restaurant may give you a dish with more spring onions as PC1. The components extracted are based on what you have in the dish, i.e. data. If you have too much soy sauce in your dish, then it might need to be called soy sauce chicken instead. PCA is a dimensionality reduction method. If you have 2 variables, then you can easily plot it as a 2D figure. If you have 3 variables, you can plot it as a 3D figure. But what if you have 10 variables? The way PCA reduces the dimensionality is through finding new origin and unit vectors that can best fit all the data. So like this line is the first component. And if it can't explain all the data, then a second line is your PC2. In intonation research, our data are not single points. Therefore, we need something more than simple PCA. Functional PCA is a tool within the functional data analysis framework. It takes curves like these as data objects for input. Each curve is a group of points, which can be seen as a function. To give you a better idea about Fpca I'll very briefly introduce the maths and general procedures behind Fpca. It is by no means enough to understand it all, so here are some useful resources that you can read to learn more. First, the input data objects. So each of these components, blue solid line, is multiplied by a score. Then all the resulting curves, the brown dotted lines, are summed up together to obtain a data object, which is the brown solid line. Then Fpca computes new origin, which is the red line, and component functions which can best suit the data, which are these 2 blue lines. They're PC1 and PC2. The sum of the origin curve plus PC curves times PC scores gives an approximate reconstruction of the original curve, that is, the curve in your data. If we go back to the recipe analogy, the PC scores can be seen as how many grams of chicken and how many grams of spring onion you put in your dish. The benefits of Fpca is that from the functional data analysis, that is using curves as input, it allows us to take the dynamic aspect of the F0 and the distal changes into consideration. And the PCA part, which is the dimensionality reduction part, allows us to sift through the noise in the data and retain only the important factors, important variations. And it is suitable for intonation research since F0 contours are curves and intonation contains a lot of variations in many aspects.
Before starting, I would like to thank Mikhail Gubian for making his code available and for taking the time to discuss Fpca and our data. Scripts to run the Fpca and the plots produced come from Gubian's GitHub. We have also listed his website with good resources and 2 papers that well illustrate the use of Fpca. I would like to familiarize you with Fpca in an overview. So as you know, the input for Fpca in our case are normalized F0 curves, which you can see here in the plot on the left. You have various durations and various shapes. And these curves are the input for Fpca. I also want to briefly discuss the output of Fpca so that you're familiar with it for when I discuss some results later on. Here you will see two principal components, PC1 and PC2. You see the mean curve in black, so this is the same curve in PC1 and PC2 because it's the mean curve. And you will see the landmark. This is a theoretically important point that the researcher will choose, and I will discuss later on, but basically it's very important for interpreting the results. So what we can see from this curve is that the red line is one standard deviation above the mean for both PC1 and PC2. In the case of PC1, here we can see a height difference. Now I'd like to go into two important aspects of Fpca, namely smoothing and landmark registration. Smoothing, as the name suggests, indicates a transformation of your raw data, the F0 curves, into smooth curves, and is guided by what you're interested in. We are not interested in microprosody in our research, so the small perturbations in F0 that come from vowels and consonants, so we want those smoothed out in our smooth curves. Typically, Fpca uses B-spline smoothing, and what you as a researcher can do is adjust the knots and lambda. Knots can be thought of as degrees of freedom, points where the curves can change direction. And here I have some illustrations so you get an idea of the thought behind it. And these knots here are represented by the dots. So you can see that a straight line has fewer dots than things such as the wiggly curve on the left. So depending on the knots, you may be overfitting your data. I'll talk about this in a second. Lambda is a regularization parameter that determines the importance of smoothness relative to fitting error. So you have to be wary of overfitting and underfitting in these cases because both can affect the results. If you overfit the data, you're going to get results that may not be as interpretable because you have lots of noise. If you underfit the data, you may not be able to interpret the results because you've removed a lot of important information. So it's important to have a balance here. And you can use generalized cross-validation to inform your choices on what lambda and knot values to use. And visual inspection is also key. And we're now going to go into an example. So here in this plot, we can see that the red dots are the original curve, and the black line is a smooth curve. With 5 knots and lambda 10 to the power of 8, we see that the curve is too smooth and we lose a lot of information. This is one extreme, so it's to show you an extreme. And now to look at the other extreme, we have 40 knots and lambda 10 to the power of 2. And here we have the opposite. We have an overfitting. And the black line, the smooth curve, fits too closely to the red dots. And actually, it may be a bit hard to see the black line because it overlaps so much. Now we can have somewhere in between as well. We have 20 knots with lambda 10 to the power of 4. And what we chose for our research question was 8 knots, lambda 10 to the power of 6. And what is important to point out here is that the beginning of all of these plots, we see a dip in the red curve, and that is microprosody. And it's something that we're not interested in. So this is what helped us to guide us on our decision to go with the 8 knots and lambda 10 to the power of 6, because in this plot in the bottom right, we don't capture that microprosody, but still capture the overall shape of the curve. Okay, and now about landmark registration. So before I start out, I want to mention that the start and end of the curve are landmarks. However, when I discuss our landmark of interest, I'm referring to the landmark in the middle. This landmark should be justified by the researcher, so it's theoretically motivated and interpretable within the specific theoretical framework, i.e. of importance. So this can typically be phone boundaries. In our research, it is the onset of the stressed vowel, as this is theoretically motivated by AM, since the stress syllable is the anchoring point for pitch accent. And what is important here is that you can have multiple landmarks. So the more controlled your data are, the easier it is to have multiple landmarks. So landmark registration aligns the important events and allows for interpretation of results. Here we have several curves, and the red dots indicate the location of the landmark. So what happens is that these points, the landmarks, are aligned in time, and they're aligned to the mean landmark time. So by having these aligned, you're able to interpret the results. And what is important to note is that by going through this whole process, time information about the time up the landmark and from the landmark to the end of the curve is no longer available, and that there is a way to reintroduce this information and it will come back later. So if we look at this process a bit, and we take the pink curve, for example, we can see that by moving the landmark to the mean landmark time, it does change the curve a little bit, but it still retains the important information. And on the next slide, we're actually going to see another example. So here in black, we have the time normalized curve with the red dot indicating the landmark. And the red dashed line is the land normalized time. And you can see that if the landmark is close to the average time of the landmark, that the curve doesn't change much. And if we look at another example, here we see that the landmark occurs relatively late on compared to the average landmark. And you can see how the curve is shifted and there is a tail at the end. So we're actually going to go into our data set and an example using our Greek data to see how we used Fpca. So this comes from a larger data set, which includes English and Greek, scripted and non-scripted speech. And here we're just looking at the Greek speech. So we chose Greek because it gives a nice illustration for our example here. And our question here is there evidence for H star and LH star contrast in Greek? And H star indicates newly introduced or given information, and LH star indicates explicitly or implicitly contrasted information. So here we can see the average curves in the corner, and you can see how on average they differ. So you see that the average curves of the two accents differ in peak height and location, which affects the fall. And this has previously been examined with very uniform data. And here we're using a bit more varied data. Okay, so in our speakers, we have 9 speakers of standard Athenian Greek, 5 female, 4 males, ages between 22 and 27. And as I mentioned, we're using scripted dialogues and text with variability. So here we have our dialogues and our texts, and H star and LH star for a total of 794 curves. So I want to go through the input of Fpca. And these are F0 curves extracted using voice sauce, specifically straight. So this is the data frame that was used as input. We have the curve ID. So this is which file it belongs to. Here you will see curve ID 1 and curve ID 2. And then we have the time column. This is our time points where the F0 values were collected. In our case, this is every millisecond. And in Y, we have our F0 values normalized by speaker. And our last column is category, which is not used in Fpca, but is rather used in plotting and later analysis. So Fpca does not take into account these categories. It is for our purposes for interpretation later on. Fpca considers the curves and extracts the main dimensions from the dataset. Another input is the landmark themselves. So again, we have the curve ID in the first column, which indicates which curve it is. L1 is the first landmark or start. L2 is the second landmark, our onset of stressed vowel. And L3 is the third landmark, or the end. And again, here we have category, which is not used in the Fpca, but for plotting and later analyses. Okay, so just as a reminder of the settings, here we used 8 knots, lambda 10 to the power of 6. And For landmark registration, we use the onset of the stressed vowel of the accented word. And this was manually annotated in Pratt. Okay, so let's jump into the output of our Fpca. So this may be familiar from a few minutes ago. We have the Fpca output. And what we can see here is that the PCs explain the dimensions of variation in the data set. We're not limited to 3 PCs. However, in our case, for these purposes, we have the 3 PCs. And as I mentioned before, the black curve is a mean curve. So this is the same across the 3 plots here. And we have our landmark, which is used for interpretation. And this is the onset of the stressed vowel. And here, in order to best understand this, let's look at the darkest red line and darkest blue line, which indicate one standard deviation above and below the mean for that respective PC. So if we look at PC1, we see that PC1 explains the difference in height of the curves. The darkest red line is higher than the lowest blue line. In PC2, the difference is in the shape of rise of the curve. So the dark red is a rise fall, versus the blue is a plateau fall. And then for PC3, we see a rise and fall of the curves are explained here. And what we see is that PC1 explains the most variation, 55.5%, and decreasing PCs subsequently explain less variation. And as I mentioned, we limit ourselves to 3 PCs, but you can look at more. Okay, so now the second part that we get from our output is this table or something similar. And what this shows is the score values, the PC scores. So you'll see in column 1, we have PC1 scores associated with each file, which is in the curve ID column, PC2 scores, and PC3 scores. So what this illustrates is that, for example, row 4 has higher PC1 than row 5. So in terms of PC1, file 4 is going to have a higher overall F0 than file 5. However, to reconstruct the curve, you'll need all these PC scores to reconstruct PCs. And this, going back to the analogy used in the beginning, is how many grams of chicken or spring onion are needed for the recipe. Okay, so we're going to now interpret the results in terms of our LH star and H star. And what we did is we used those scores that I just discussed, and we ran LMERs to see if they were significant in terms of accent. So here I have the average curves for reference, just to keep those in mind. And again, we're going to start with PC1, which, as we mentioned, explains the difference in the height of the curves. And here in this plot, you'll see the scaled PC score. So these are Z-scores. So scaled PC score of 1 corresponds to the darkest red line in our PC plot in the upper right corner. And our stats revealed that LH star has higher PC1 scores than H star. So overall, the LH star has higher overall F0 curves. Okay, now going on to the second. Again, I have the average curves to help us interpret. We have PC2, and as we described, this explains a difference in the shape of a curve, whether we have a rise fall or a plateau fall. And here, again, we found a difference in PC2 scores per accent. So the stats reveal that LH star has higher PC2 than H star. So this is more like the red curve. Okay, and here we're going to discuss PC3. So PC3, you have the plot there in the corner to see that it differs in terms of the rise-fall shape. And we see again that accent is significant in terms of PC3. So here, H star has higher PC3 values than LH star. Okay. So here we have scatter plots of the PC scores. So PC1 by PC2, PC1 by PC3, PC2 by PC3. And here the LH star and H star accents can be distinguished between these three PCs. So they're distinct in each of these PCs, but still overlap, as you can see. And this captures variability as well as what makes them distinct categories.
Fpca can be also used in the tonal language. I will use Tianjin Mandarin data to illustrate how we can do that. Tianjin Mandarin has 4 lexical tones. One key thing to do Fpca is that you should model the intonation tone by tone, not pulling them all together, especially when you don't have prior knowledge about this variety. So here we are investigating the differences between statement, which are the blue lines, and intonation yes/no question. Intonation yes/no question is like asking a question without any syntactic markings. So for instance, an utterance like coffee, when you want to turn it into a intonation yes/no question, you say coffee. Yeah. The materials used in this study are very simple syllables. They are ma, ma, mi, but in 4 tones. The landmarks used here are the onset of the syllable and offset of the syllable, and also the boundary between the onset and the rhyme. The results are quite interesting. And different from the Greek data, only 2 PCs are enough to explain all the variations, and PC1 alone is explaining 89.8% of the variation. So PC1 is showing a height difference, F0 height difference. The question has higher register than the statements. And PC2 is showing a shape difference towards the end. So the questions doesn't fall as much as the statements. The rest of the tones are pretty similar. For rising tones, it's also showing a higher register for the questions and also a much higher rise than the statement rise. Tone 3 is very similar to tone 2. Tone 4 has very similar results as tone 1. All in all 4 tones are showing that the questions have higher register than the statements. And in the questions, the falling tones don't fall as much as in the statements. And for the rising tones, the questions rise more than the statements.
So we've now seen a couple examples of Fpca, which allows us to interpret our dynamic data. However, it's not the only way to interpret dynamic data. And here we'll see that the 2 methods that we want to discuss, Fpca and generalized additive mixed models, answer different research questions. So with Fpca, we saw that it was a dimensionality reduction in which we're able to observe important variation in data sets. And with GAMS, we can directly examine the categories of interest to see if and how they differ. Okay, so here are the packages that we used with both of these, and now we will briefly look into GAMS. As a brief introduction to generalized additive mixed models, or GAMS, I want to mention that this is another statistical analysis used for dynamic data, which allows for modeling of non-linear effects. So, which is good for our research because we can look at curves. Okay, so here we have a quote from Wheeling, a non-linear regression model which does not require aggregation or the pre-selection of a fixed time point. And it is able to identify general patterns over dynamically varying data while simultaneously accounting for subject and item-related variability. So in our case, this is actually quite complementary to look at the Fpca and the GAMS together with our Greek data set. So to run our GAMS, we used Martin Soskouthi's 2017 tutorial, Generalized Additive Mixed Models for Dynamic Analysis in Linguistics, a Practical Introduction. Okay. And what we did here is, rather than using the raw curves as input as we did for Fpca, what we did is we used the landmark registered data with GAMS as input to examine H star and LH star. Okay, so we have this landmark registered data, which is really important because it helps us in the interpretation of results. So I'm going to jump into the results that we got. Here we see the model's prediction of our H star and LH star curves. And what I think I would like to point out here is that these are actually very similar to the average curves that we've been seeing throughout this presentation. So this is a good sign. It means that the model is doing a good job. It's predicting the curves that we see. And here again, I labeled the landmark with the vertical line. And this plot over here indicates the difference between the two categories. So these red lines indicate a difference from 0 to 5.6 milliseconds and from 224.8 to 522.6 milliseconds, so almost near the end. And what this is very interesting is that the difference, the really big difference from just before the landmark to the end of the curve is supported statistically. So we see it in the plot and it's supported statistically. And here, how we're going to interpret this plot is it's a difference plot. So you can take these values in the curve and add it to the H star curve on the right to get the LH star curve. So here what we're seeing is that there is a difference in the two, LH star and H star, and it occurs mainly starting around the landmark till almost the end of the file, and also just slightly at the beginning. Okay, so we've just gone into a lot of detail, probably pretty quickly, so I want to take a moment now in case there's any questions and I'd like to address them. Okay, I would like to take a moment to answer a couple of the questions. One I've already answered in the chat, and the other is, could you elaborate on what kind of variation you had in the Greek data for the Fpca analysis? As far as I know, certain kinds of variation can be quite problematic for Fpca, especially in interpretation. Different numbers of syllables between landmarks. So we had words, different words of varying lengths, and that is why it was so important to have the landmark registration so that we were able to interpret the data in terms of this onset of the stressed vowel.
Okay. Can I just to add a little bit here? We're working with an AM understanding of how the curves work. So it is not just a matter of modeling the curves, but understanding where curves change relative to segmental landmarks. So for us, the interpretation was not particularly challenging because we use the landmarks in order to understand this aspect of the curves. I hope this answers your question, Annalisa.
Okay, so now we will keep an eye on the chat and continue the rest of the presentation, and we'll be happy to answer more at the end. Okay, so now that we've looked at one-dimensional Fpca, we're going to look at two-dimensional Fpca. So what we're going to do here is we're going to reintroduce the durational information. Okay, and we're not only going to look at F0 curves, but also the duration of the segments. So from the start to the landmark and from the landmark to the end. So that is going to be reintroduced so we can interpret the F0 curves in conjunction with the duration of the segments. And here I want to mention this paper because it has an example of 2D Fpca to help you understand it better. So we're going to go back into our Greek data and show you what happened there. Okay, so hopefully by now you're familiar with the top plot of the PC1 F0 curves. And what I want to highlight here is the bottom part, which is the new part for us. So again, in order to understand this, I want to use the extreme example of one standard deviation above the PC1 mean. So that's the dark red line. And so we can see that this dark red line is associated with a higher F0 curve overall. So looking at the top plot. In addition, it is associated with a shortening of the first segment and a lengthening of the second segment. So this first segment is from the beginning to the landmark, and the second being from the landmark to the end. Okay, and this, when we ran the stats on this, it was significant for accent. And here the LH star had higher values than the H star. Okay, here PC2, this was not significant for accent, and PC3, which was significant for accent. And here the LH star was associated with lower values of PC3, and H star had higher values for PC3. So this means that for LH star, we would be more like the blue line, shall we say. So here in PC3, we see that there is a fall, sharpening of the fall, and a global lengthening of duration. And here, if we consider this, this might help put things in perspective.
The last part is about random forest. Random forest is a machine learning algorithm. Random forest builds multiple decision trees and merges them together to get a more accurate and stable prediction. It can be used to rank importance of variables. It does that by giving an index called the mean decrease accuracy. It expresses how much accuracy the model loses by excluding each variable. The more accurate, the more the accuracy suffers, the more important the variable is for successful classification. In our study, we have the PC scores, PC1, PC2, PC3, and other variables of interest, syllable duration, and energy. Yeah, you can use any variables that are of interest to you. It doesn't have to be the PCs. We would like to see which variable is the most important factor in the data. The general procedures for random forest are as follows. The first step is to prepare the input data. We're using the same data frame that contains the PC scores and the labels for the variables of interest. So the PC scores and syllable duration and energy. And then we partition the data into a train set and a test set. This is regular operation in any predictive modeling method. In our case, we have 311 high stars and 246 low high stars in the train set, and 134 high stars and 103 low high stars in the test set. Because our data are not balanced, so we did the third step, which is balancing the data set. This is an optional method. If you have already got balanced data, then you can ignore this step. To balance the data set, there are different sampling techniques. The first technique is called undersampling. That is to remove samples from the majority class, like this one, reducing 311 to 246. And there's another method called oversampling. That means you add more examples from the minority class. Yeah, like this. We use the R package rows. In our study, we used oversampling because it's a predictive task. So we only oversample the train set. And we randomly duplicated 130 low-high stars. The next step is automatic variable selection. This is also an optional step. In our case, we have a very small number of variables, and also they are selected according to the theory. So we did not do this step. But for a study with more complicated variable pool, then you can use this step, this package, to run the algorithm and ask the algorithm to give you what are the most important factors. Then you can put it back in the random forest to model it. Because we didn't do that, we did step 5 directly, which is the modeling. For random forest modeling, we used random forest package in R. The final model we had was including all of our variables of interest. And the results. The results are easier to understand if we plot it in the confusion matrix. So basically how many high stars we got right and how many low high stars we got right. By including all the variables, the model was substantially improved from 56.5% to 86.5%. So that's a big improvement. And these two numbers are basically the most important numbers to evaluate the model. And you can also get a confidence interval between 81 to 90. That's not bad. The sensitivity and specificity are the accuracies for your high stars and low high star predictions. Then let's have a look at the random forest result of the importance ranking. For us, the question is the difference between accents. So PC1 explains the most variability from the data, but not the variability between the accents. So we use a random forest to see what differentiates the two accents. The results are showing that PC3 has is the most important variable, although it only explains a small percentage of the data, around 14 to 15%. The variability PC3 explained was critical from a linguistic perspective, although it's not that high. And then following PC3, there's PC1 and syllable duration, and PC2, and then the least important variable is energy, the scale of energy. To recap, in part 3, we introduced what PCA is, what Fpca is, smoothing and landmark registration. And then we showed you how to do 1D Fpca in Greek data and in Tianjin Mandarin data. And then we showed you how to use GAMs to do intonation research and how to include the time information back with 2D Fpca. Last but not least, we showed you how to rank the importance of variables using random forest. In conclusion, this workshop offered an introduction of the theories, annotation tools, and modeling methods which are currently used in intonation research. One of our aims was to present those tools and methods to linguists, and we hope they will be helpful in your intonation research. Our other aim was to bridge the gap between speech technology and linguistics by introducing recent development in intonation research from a linguistic perspective. Machine learning can achieve very good results without the need to understand linguistic structure. However, those methods depend on large amount of data, which are not available in every language. For such languages, the methods we present here may be the best way forward. We hope you enjoyed the tutorial. Now it's question time.
We hope you enjoyed the workshop. We're going to put up the slides up on our OSF. I have put up our Twitter accounts here. Feel free to contact us. Our OSF is a Sprint project. Yeah, you can find it on our Twitter.
Hi, everybody. I wanted to actually answer a few more of the, in more detail, one of the questions. This was the question about the variation in the Greek data, because I think this is a very important point. In the Greek data, we used as the window of analysis the prosodic word. So that is usually a content word with any clitics, which in Greek can be articles as proclitics, possessive pronouns as enclitics on nouns, as well as certain particles that you find before verb forms. So for us, the point was not to actually try to analyze entire contours in one go. Again, we're asked to stop sharing our screen, which we have already done. So I hope you can hear me. So for us, the most important thing was that we start from certain linguistic expectations. And one of these expectations is that pitch accents synchronize with prosodic words. in some way. And so our window of analysis was the prosodic word. In Greek, that means that after the landmark registration, you can have up to 3 syllables because of how the language is organized. Before landmark registration, you can have more syllables. But we were not looking at entire utterances because in this particular instance, our aim was to see the contours on particular words on the assumption that these contours represent realizations of pitch accents. So again, what your window of analysis is and whether landmark registration will work or what landmark registration you want to use or how many landmarks you want to have is something that is determined by your research questions. Maybe a take-home point here may need to be that there is no correct way or accurate way of doing prosodic analysis, because if you're interested in modeling F0, there are better ways and worse ways of doing that. But if you're interested in doing an intonation analysis, either for linguistic purposes or for predicted purposes in TTS, then you are making some assumptions that are linguistic assumptions. You're making an analysis, and the analysis will only be correct if it actually covers the data. So to give a simple example, Penta makes the assumption that every syllable is associated with a particular tone. This assumption does not work if you have tonal crowding like I presented in the first part of the workshop. So if you have something very short like li and you have to say li, then you run into trouble if you make the assumptions of Penta. So the proof of the accuracy of a particular analysis is in how well it can predict the realization of particular contours. If you have any other questions, please let us know. We'll have another look. And as everybody mentioned, you can always find us on Twitter, and you can find the materials on OSF as well. So everybody want to come and can't see us. They can see us if we're all here. So would like to thank everybody for attending and for asking very interesting and challenging questions. If you have any more questions, we still have a few more minutes, so let us know. Otherwise, again, you can reach us again via a number of different means. Thank you, and
thank you.
Bye, everybody. Oh, okay.
Thank you very much for this very interesting tutorial. I have a question on the random forest analysis. I also played around with them in my own research. I was thinking about what to do about the fact that F0 values of a contour would be highly autocorrelated. Is this the case for the PC values you used as well? In GAMS, one can easily account for autocorrelation in the data, but I'm not sure about random forest. Do you have an opinion on that? I think my understanding is you deal with the autocorrelation problem in the Fpca. So Fpca would get rid of that for you. And in GAMS, yeah, you have various ways of getting rid of the autocorrelation problem. So random forest is more like a step after that step. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that mean they can?
We see that there are some raised hands, and we're just trying to figure out how to address them.
Invite.
Yeah,
Invite,
click invite,
okay.
and let's see.
Maybe we can talk.
And they can choose to respond or not.
Okay.
I understand. Yeah, that's what they do. Okay. What happened to the next one? I can't see. What does it say? What's the orange one?
This is at 1 o'clock. Should we go back to the chat
Yeah,
then?
go back to the
So we're going to go back to the chat now to see if there's any further questions. I'm going to turn this off, I guess. Okay, well, we don't see any more questions, but we'll be here until 2. And also, as we've mentioned, you can email us or contact us via Twitter